He lived 10 years inside a silence that he had chosen himself, convincing his own heart that this emptiness was peace. 10 years waking up at the exact same time, doing the exact same chores, sleeping on the exact same side of the bed, the right side, because the left side belonged to a memory he simply didn't have the courage to occupy. 10 years looking out at the golden wheat fields of his ranch at dusk without truly seeing anything at all. And then a woman arrived on a September afternoon with a brown leather suitcase and a way of smiling at the birds resting on the roof that he had never seen in anyone else. And nothing was ever the same again. Can you imagine spending an entire decade believing that forcing your heart to stop wanting things is a form of loyalty? That the absolute best way to honor someone you lost is to never let anyone else get close? That loneliness, when chosen carefully enough, can disguise itself as dignity so well that even you end up believing the lie. It is about this man that our story speaks today, and about the woman who, without trying anything, without forcing a single thing, just by being exactly who she was, got close enough to make him remember what it feels like to truly be alive. This happened in September of 1934, in the rugged heart of Montana, on a sprawling property called Whispering Pines Ranch, nestled between hills covered in century-old ponderosa pines, where the wind had a habit of singing through the branches as if it knew secrets that mankind hadn't yet discovered. Before I continue, I need to ask you for something very special. Write down here in the comments where you are watching this story from. It could be the name of your city or state or just a simple hello. It makes a huge difference to me knowing that you are right there on the other side of the screen. And if this channel is still new to you, please consider subscribing and leaving your like, because every single week there is a new story waiting for you. Now, come with me, because this is one of the most beautiful stories I have ever had the pleasure of telling. The previous winter had been particularly harsh in the Elk Creek Valley. The bitter frosts had arrived earlier than expected in November of 1933 and packed up later than they should have in April, leaving behind a trail of whitened pastures and wooden fences coated in a thin layer of ice that caught the morning light, transforming it into thousands of tiny diamonds scattered across the earth. Whispering Pines Ranch had endured, as it always endured, because Elias Drummond was not the kind of man who let things break without first doing everything in his power to hold them together. At 48 years old, Elias was what the local townsfolk called a man of his word. Tall, with broad shoulders that years of grueling ranch work had sculpted with a precision no tailor could ever replicate in fabric. He had hair that had begun to grey at the temples around the time he turned 40, now forming that striking mixture of chestnut and silver that made some of the women in the village whisper among themselves when he rode by on his buckskin horse on Saturday mornings. His eyes were the colour of dark honey, a deep amber that, at certain hours of the afternoon, when the light hit them sideways, seemed to harbour a contained fire that could no longer find a way out. He had the hands of heavy labour, the knuckles marked, the palms calloused by decades of reins, hose and thick rope. But he also had the fingers of someone who once knew how to play the acoustic guitar with delicate grace, long and precise fingers that now only served to tighten saddles and sign bills of sale. He was fair with his ranch hands, punctual with his payroll, and gentle with the animals in a way that some found exaggerated. But that Silas, his trusted foreman, simply called the mark of a man with a good soul. He didn't drink more than he ought to. He didn't get involved in brawls or town gossip. He attended Sunday service more out of habit than devotion, always sitting in the exact same pew on the right side, looking at the reverend with that neutral expression of a man whose body is present, but whose spirit is wandering somewhere nobody else could reach. And that was exactly where the beautiful description of Elias Drummond ended. Because beneath all that solidness, beneath all that imposing physical presence, beneath all that stellar reputation built over decades of honest work and right decisions, there was an empty space that he had learned to never look at directly. as if looking it straight in the eye was far too dangerous, as if naming that void was the same as inviting it to grow even larger, to take up even more space until there was nothing left of him at all. Hattie, who was 67 years old and who had been cooking at the ranch since before Elias was even born, used to say to herself, never to him, because Hattie was wise enough to know when words heal and when they only harden what is already too rigid, that the boss had turned into one of those ponderosa pines out in the yard, too beautiful on the outside, too solid on the outside, possessing a presence that impressed everyone and that could outlast any violent storm. But with its branches reaching up to the sky, like someone begging for something they no longer know how to name. She also used to say that it was all Eleanor's fault, not in a malicious way, not with anger or resentment. She said it with the tender grace of someone who understands that sometimes a love that is too beautiful leaves scars that take a lifetime to heal, and that the problem isn't the scar itself. It's when a person decides that the scar is all they have left, choosing to guard it like a precious treasure instead of treating it for what it truly is, a lingering memory that stays but that doesn't need to steal the place of the present. Eleanor Drummond had been one of the most luminous women Hattie had ever met in her long life. The daughter of a merchant from Bozeman, she had arrived at Whispering Pines Ranch as Elias's bride in 1918, when he was 32 and she was 26. And she had single-handedly transformed that house of serious, silent men into a home that smelled of fresh flowers, music, and laughter echoing through the dark wooden hallways, as if the building itself had finally learned how to smile. Elias, before Eleanor, was a good man, but a restrained one, efficient, responsible, carrying a seriousness that the elders admired, but that folks his own age found a bit premature for someone so young. Elias, with Eleanor, was a completely different man. He was the man who would climb to the very top rung of the corral gate just to reach a branch of wild plums she had asked for to make preserves. The man who hummed off-key while saddling the horses, completely unbothered when Silas imitated him with affectionate mockery. The man who sat on the cedar porch every single afternoon, right when the sun started to sink behind the hills, looking out at the golden fields with the expression of a man who genuinely and unconditionally believed that the world was an extraordinary place, and that he somehow had been handed the most generous slice of it. They had married on a September afternoon in 1918, in a simple ceremony at the little church in Elk Creek, with the scent of fresh rain still hanging in the air and the fields surrounding the village glowing with a damp, vibrant green. Hattie had baked a spiced walnut cake with honey glaze that everyone talked about for months afterward, always with that wistful tone of describing something that could never be recreated. Silas had spent the entire day failing to hide his teary eyes, vehemently denying it later with a dry humor that fooled absolutely no one. And Elias had looked at Eleanor throughout the entire ceremony with an expression that words simply cannot hold, the expression of a man who cannot believe his own astounding luck and is terrified to blink, afraid he might lose what is standing right in front of him. They had 8 years together. 8 years of bitter winters, where she would throw more firewood into the hearth than was strictly necessary, because she adored the smell of burning pine and saw no sense in rationing comfort. Of warm summers where they would walk down to the willow pond at dusk, barefoot, sitting on the thick roots sloping into the water until the mosquitoes finally drove them back inside. Of endless, meandering conversations that stretched deep into the early hours of the morning, blending the profound and the trivial without distinction. A duck she had named the Colonel because he had a pompous little waddle she found hilarious. A cloud shaped undeniably like a cowboy boot that Elias had pointed out with utmost seriousness, as if it were a crucial geographical fact, causing her to laugh for 5 straight minutes. That full-body laugh that he collected the way other men hoarded acres of land. In December of 1926, On a Thursday of low, heavy skies and damp wind, Eleanor caught a fever. Hattie hated telling this part of the story. Elias never spoke of it at all. Silas would stare hard at the floorboard whenever the subject edged too close, as if the ground itself was safer for his eyes than anything else in the room. But all three of them knew every agonizing detail of those days as if they were tattooed on the inside of their ribs. The county doctor had come on Friday and done what he could, which wasn't much, because medicine in 1926 in rural Montana was exactly what it was: good intentions paired with desperately scarce resources. The following Monday, Eleanor Drummond slipped away on a morning of entirely grey skies, with Elias's rough hand gripping hers with a desperate force that changed absolutely nothing, a grip he didn't loosen even when she went still. Elias was 40 years old on that Monday morning, and it was right there, in that exact shattering moment, that he made a decision he never verbalized to a living soul, but which became glaringly obvious to anyone watching him in the months and years that followed. He closed a heavy door inside himself. He didn't slam it in a fit of rage. He didn't lock it with bitter resentment. He closed it carefully, with an almost ceremonial delicacy, like a man preserving something infinitely precious inside a room he will never use again, but which he simply lacks the heart to dismantle. In the 10 years that followed, Whispering Pines Ranch grew increasingly productive and increasingly silent at the exact same time, as if those two things were inevitably bound. The emptier the house felt on the inside, the more manic energy there was to pour into the punishing labor on the outside. The wheat grew tall and golden. The cattle herd expanded consistently. The house remained spotless, functional, and deeply perfumed by Hattie's cooking, but the rocking chairs on the cedar porch sat empty for longer and longer stretches, the wood slowly darkening under the punishing sun and driving rain, quietly begging for someone who was never coming back. Eleanor's acoustic guitar stayed hung on the living room wall, gathering dust with an almost respectful slowness, and no one had the courage to take it down or pack it away, because either option felt like a final declaration no one was ready to make. The flowers she had planted in the side garden, yellow roses, vibrant marigolds, and a large lavender bush that sweetened the entire afternoon when the wind hit it just right, continued to be tended by Hattie in absolute silence, a discreet living memorial that didn't need to be spoken of to be entirely understood. Elias worked, he slept, he woke up. He worked some more, and whenever someone, a well-meaning relative dropping by for the holidays, a concerned neighboring rancher, or a reverend who felt it was his spiritual duty, dared to gently suggest that it was time to move on, that Eleanor would have wanted him to find happiness, that a man of his constitution and high character shouldn't spend the rest of his life completely alone inside a ranch house, far too big for one person. Elias would listen with that educated patience that folks easily mistook for agreement. He heard every word. He let the other person finish. He thanked them for their concern with genuine, unshakable dignity. And then he would change the subject with a mastery so smooth, so breathtakingly natural, that the other person only realized they had been carefully redirected when they were already deep into a conversation about something else entirely, completely unsure of how they got there. That was exactly how things stood at Whispering Pines Ranch in September of 1934, when the mayor of Elk Creek, Harrison Vance, showed up on a Tuesday morning at the front porch with his hat in his hands, a wide, nervous smile, and that unmistakable aura of a man who needs a massive favor and has been rehearsing his approach ever since he left his driveway. Elias was mending a leather bridle on the porch when he saw the dust rising on the dirt road heading toward the ranch. He recognized the mayor's roan horse from a mile away by the white star on its forehead. He waited. He kept working. The bridle didn't require his full attention, and it certainly didn't receive it, but his eyes remained fixed on the leather as the horse's hooves drew closer, stopped at the steps, and the heavy weight of the mare descended with a discreet grunt. Harrison Vance was a 55-year-old man, carrying a friendly, rounded belly, thinning hair, and the booming voice of a man born to give speeches in the town square. He genuinely liked Elias Drummond, which made what he was about to ask simultaneously easier and much harder. Easier because there was real trust between them. Harder because he knew Elias was the kind of man who instantly knew when he was being manipulated and who would mentally file that realization away without saying a word, which was, in many ways, far worse than a direct confrontation. The mayor explained the dire situation with meandering apologies that took nearly 12 minutes, while Elias listened in total silence, the leather bridle resting in his lap, pushing a thick needle through the tough hide while the other man talked. The county doctor, Dr. Arthur Caldwell, a fine man as everyone knew, having served Elk Creek for 23 years, had passed away the month before at 68 from a sudden heart failure he hadn't diagnosed in time, being the sort of doctor who took meticulous care of everyone except himself. The town council had managed with immense effort and through a connection at a hospital in Denver to secure the services of a fully trained, registered nurse who would come to serve the region indefinitely, possibly for an entire year, depending on how things went. The problem, and here Harrison paused to wring his hat in his hands with the agonizing care of someone carefully selecting his next words, was that the only boarding house in Elk Creek had just 3 rooms, and all of them were occupied by railroad surveyors who paid on time and had nowhere else to sleep. The nurse needed proper, decent accommodation, hosted by a respectable, trustworthy figure. And Whispering Pines Ranch, with its massive 8-bedroom house where only 1 room was regularly occupied, was by far the most suitable, dignified place in the entire valley to host her. Elias remained perfectly quiet for a long moment after the mayor finally ran out of breath. He carefully set the leather bridle aside. He looked out at the rolling fields spreading beyond the porch railing, out toward the ponderosa pines on the horizon that were glowing in that specific color of early autumn, a deep, heavy green preparing for the cold. Then he looked at Harrison. The mayor hastily added, using the desperate tone of a man playing his very last card before accepting defeat, that the woman was a widow, highly discreet, of impeccable moral character, and came with the most glowing references from the Denver hospital where she had worked. He stressed that the people of the valley desperately needed decent medical care, that the situation had been terrifying since Dr. Caldwell's passing, and that any serious emergency forced local families to endure a grueling 25-mile wagon ride over brutal dirt roads to the next county, which, with their transportation, was practically an entire day's journey. Elias fiercely detested being emotionally manipulated. He loathed when people used the genuine suffering of others as leverage to extract what they wanted. But the inescapable problem was that this wasn't manipulation. It was the cold, hard truth. He had seen with his own 2 eyes what the lack of a doctor or a trained healer had cost a few local families in the past month alone. And that heavy truth weighed on him in a way that no argument of personal convenience could ever counterbalance. He finally said yes, wearing the grim expression of a man making a highly calculated sacrifice, wanting the other man to know he was fully aware of it. 3 weeks, he said firmly. The nurse could stay for 3 weeks while the town council scrambled to find a more permanent solution. Harrison pumped his hand with such vigorous enthusiasm that his hat nearly fell in the dirt again, and this time the mayor didn't even care. What neither of those 2 men knew, what all of Elk Creek would only discover slowly in the way truly important things always reveal themselves, in tiny fragments that only make sense when stitched together, was that those 3 weeks were going to turn into something much, much bigger. And that firm handshake wasn't just a political favor between 2 men. It was, without them realizing it, the very first step of a beautiful story that Whispering Pines Ranch had been desperately waiting for a very long time. The afternoon Clara Alden arrived at Whispering Pines Ranch was one of those golden September days that Montana seems to reserve specially, as if the vast sky knew that certain arrivals require a backdrop worthy of them. The sun was dipping low but still intensely bright, casting that specific late afternoon glow that turns the most mundane object into something that looks painted with pure intention. The rolling fields bordering the ranch were a vibrant, waving gold, and the ponderosa pines on the horizon cast silhouettes so perfectly sharp against a sky turning burnt orange that it made anyone stop for a second, even just 1 second, just to stand and stare. The wagon that brought Clara down the dirt road arrived kicking up a fine, pale dust that the crisp wind quickly carried away. She stepped down before the wagon had even rolled to a complete stop, moving with the quiet, practiced agility of someone accustomed to not waiting around for conveniences. She grabbed her own heavy brown leather suitcase, carried it straight up to the porch without asking for a lick of help, and stood looking up at the facade of the grand ranch house for a moment. She wore an expression that Hattie, who had stepped out to welcome her, later described to Silas as the look of someone seeing not what a place is, but what it could be. The main house of Whispering Pines Ranch was built of dark timber, imposing without being arrogant, boasting 2 stories and a sweeping wraparound porch on the ground floor facing the western sunset. It had been built by Elias's father using timber felled from their own land, and decades of weathering had given the heavy boards that deep, rich mahogany color that no store-bought paint could ever imitate. The windows were tall and narrow, framed in wood painted white, a white the years had worn down to a distressed, honest shade that was far more beautiful than the original. The side garden was blooming generously. Eleanor's yellow roses, which Hattie tended like a silent, sacred promise, were fully open that afternoon, and the large lavender bush sweetened the crisp air for a 30-foot radius. Clara Alden took a deep, deliberate breath when the scent of lavender hit her. And Hattie, observing everything closely from the front door, noticed that deep breath and smiled. She was 38 years old. Chestnut hair pinned up in a practical no-nonsense bun that the long journey had slightly loosened at the sides, allowing a few stray wisps to frame her face in a way that probably wasn't intentional, but was, nonetheless, undeniably striking. She had eyes of a color that shifted constantly between slate gray and soft green, depending on the light. The kind of eyes you look at once thinking you know the shade, only to look again and realize you knew nothing at all. She wasn't particularly tall, but she carried herself with a posture that made her seem taller than she was, the solid stance of a woman who knows exactly how much space she takes up in the world and refuses to apologize for a single inch of it. Her hands were unmistakably the hands of a nurse, competent, steady, bearing those specific faint calluses on the fingertips that come from years of handling medical instruments with absolute care. She wore a navy blue cotton dress with a neatly folded beige linen coat draped over her arm. Over the many months that followed, Elias would be deeply surprised to realize he remembered that specific dress with a razor-sharp precision he couldn't explain. The exact navy shade, the shape of the collar, the 2 crisp pleats down the front. Hattie welcomed her with the warm, bustling efficiency of someone who doesn't need formal introductions to make a stranger feel at home. She took the heavy suitcase, led the way inside, offered a glass of cold pressed apple cider that was still chilling in the new icebox Elias had purchased the year before, and chatted about the house as they climbed the wooden stairs. She gave the quick history, the simple house rules: breakfast sharply at 6, supper at 7, the bathroom at the end of the hall had hot water as long as the wood stove was blazing, and the wood stove was always blazing. Clara listened to every word and said thank you with a direct, grounded kindness that wasn't a polite performance or an obligation. It was simply the authentic way she treated people. The room Hattie had meticulously prepared for her was on the east side of the house, with a large window facing the weeping willow pond. It was a simple, sturdy room with wide plank floors, a white-painted iron bed frame, a patchwork quilt in calming shades of blue and cream that Hattie had washed and smoothed out specially for her, and a small wooden dresser with an oval mirror resting on top. Resting on the windowsill was a tiny sprig of fresh lavender in a small glass cup, a tiny detail Hattie had added without overthinking it, just because it was September and the lavender was fully blooming in the yard. Clara placed her suitcase on the wooden chair, walked straight to the window and stood gazing out at the pond for a long time. The late afternoon light caught the surface of the water, turning it into a quiet, perfect mirror. The sweeping branches of the willows hung down so low they almost touched their own reflections, and a solitary duck paddled aimlessly on the left side, entirely unhurried. It was a picture so complete it almost felt unreal. This woman, who had left the bustling streets of Denver with a suitcase, a leather medical kit, and the vague, aching idea that she desperately needed a fresh start somewhere, stood looking at that quiet pond for much longer than the moment required. And she felt, in a profound way she wouldn't be able to name for quite some time, that perhaps she had arrived at a place worth knowing. Elias was far out in the back pasture when the wagon finally arrived. He was inspecting a barbed wire fence Silas had flagged as a priority, working with that intense, serious focus of an experienced rancher who treats every minor repair as a matter of absolute professional honor. He found out their guest had arrived when Silas himself marched up to him with that wide, rolling stride, his thumbs hooked tightly into his leather belt. His thick mustache slightly bristled at the corner, which was the closest Silas ever got to showing visible excitement. The foreman announced, using the extreme economy of words that was his personal trademark, that the young lady had arrived, that Hattie was taking good care of her, and that her leather bag bore a faded tag from St. E. Luke's Hospital in Denver. Elias gave a sharp nod. He went right back to fixing the fence. Silas stood frozen for a second, about 6 feet away, staring at his boss's broad back with the conflicted expression of a man who has much more to say, but is rapidly calculating if the timing is right. He decided it wasn't. He turned on his heel and walked away with the exact same rolling stride he had arrived with. It was only an hour later, when the sun had completely sunk behind the rolling hills, and the vast sky was caught in that breathtaking transition from fiery orange to deep violet. A transition that lasts only a few precious minutes, and that most folks miss because they are too busy looking down at something else, that Elias finally walked back to the main house. He entered through the heavy back door, as had been his unwavering habit for decades. He hung his dusty hat on the iron hook to the left of the doorframe. He scrubbed his hands at the kitchen sink, using the harsh lye soap Hattie made from scratch every month. And it was then that he heard the voices drifting from the living room. Hattie's warm, gravelly voice, thick with that western drawl that always got heavier when she was comfortable, and another voice he didn't instantly recognize. The new voice was calm, much calmer than he had anticipated. He didn't quite know why he had harbored any expectations at all, but he had, and this voice instantly defied them in a way he registered in his gut before he could even verbalize what he was noticing. He walked slowly to the living room doorway and stopped. Clara Alden was standing near the tall window that looked out over the side garden, caught in the exact angle where the very last fading light of the day pierced the glass and illuminated her chestnut hair, highlighting the loose strands escaping her bun in a way she was certainly entirely unaware of. She had her hands clasped loosely in front of her, the beige coat now draped over the back of a chair, and she was responding to something Hattie had just said with a look of pure, genuine attention on her face. Not that polite, glazed attention of someone just waiting for their turn to speak, but the deep, rare attention of someone who actually cares about what the other person is saying. She turned her head the moment she heard his heavy boots on the hardwood floor. And Elias realized in a fleeting moment that lasted only the span of a single breath, a moment he would later try and utterly fail not to constantly revisit in his memory, that her eyes were the exact color of the willow pond on days when the sky was thick with clouds. That shifting slate green that refuses to be just one thing, that morphs depending on what it's reflecting, that is never exactly the same from 1 hour to the next. She said good evening. She stated her name. She said she was incredibly grateful for his hospitality and promised to be as little of a bother as humanly possible. Elias said good evening. He stated his name, though she undoubtedly already knew it. He gruffly informed her that supper was served exactly at 7 and that Hattie would handle anything she might need, and then he turned and retreated into his office. Hattie, who had been watching this incredibly brief encounter from the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed tightly over her flour-dusted apron, turned back to her cast-iron stove with a tiny, private smile that wasn't meant for anyone else to see. But she saw it, and it was enough. Supper at 7 o'clock was an excruciating exercise in polite silence. The massive oak dining table had room for 12 people during days of harvest and loud gatherings, and the 2 chairs Hattie had meticulously set were at the head of the table, where Elias always sat, where he had always sat, and on the right side, 2 empty spaces down. Hattie had strategically chosen this spot as the perfect middle ground between intimidatingly close and awkwardly distant. Clara arrived precisely at 7, wearing a soft grey wool cardigan over her dress, her hair still pinned up, but with its neatness restored. She sat down without an ounce of ceremony, and without that vibrating, nervous energy people often carry when trying to make a good first impression in a strange house. She simply sat. She smoothed her cloth napkin over her lap. She looked at the steaming platter of braised short ribs and hearty pinto beans in the center of the table, with the exact same direct, grounded attention she had given to absolutely everything else since she walked through the door. Hattie had slow-roasted the ribs with herbs from the garden, using a recipe she had carried in her memory for 40 years, placing it next to a heavy cast-iron pot of beans, fragrant with bay leaf and garlic, fluffy white rice, and a bowl of finely sliced winter greens, wilted in oil. There was also a tall glass pitcher of cold apple cider sweating in the warm room, which Elias drank every single night for as long as Hattie could remember. Clara looked at the pitcher with a genuine curiosity she made no attempt to hide. She asked if it was fresh cider. Elias nodded and said that it was. He said the old apple orchard was out past the back garden, right along the old fence line. He mentioned Hattie pressed it fresh every day when the apples were in season, Clara said, her tone softening slightly, slowing down, becoming a fraction more personal, that it had been years since she tasted fresh-pressed cider like that her grandmother used to have a sprawling apple orchard behind her house in Billings, that she made it every autumn, and that the smell hanging in the air was identical. Elias grunted softly and noted that the winters out here were notoriously unforgiving, especially down in the bottom of the valley where the frost settled. Clara looked right at him and said she was well prepared. And then the silence returned. But it was a silence that possessed a fundamentally different texture than the heavy silence that usually haunted that large dining room. It wasn't the crushing, solitary silence of a grieving man eating alone with his dark thoughts. It was the tentative silence of 2 capable people who don't know a single thing about each other yet, and are still trying to figure out what questions are actually worth asking. Elias ate while staring down at his plate with his usual intense focus. But every now and then, 3 times, maybe 4, he flicked his eyes up for a fraction of a second and caught Clara gazing out the dining room window. The garden outside was now pitch black, and she watched the darkness with the calm, serene expression of someone who knows how to be quiet without the silence making her itch. Someone who felt no desperate urge to fill the empty air with useless chatter. Someone who had figured out, at some hard point in her life, that the people who constantly need to fill every silence are usually terrified of hearing what the quiet actually has to say. That profound comfort surprised him far more than it should have. After supper, she politely excused herself, thanked Hattie with that same direct, piercing kindness the cook had already identified as a core character trait rather than a polite reflex, and headed upstairs to her room. Elias lingered at the table for a few more minutes, nursing the hot tin mug of strong black coffee Hattie had silently placed beside him without being asked. He listened to the sound of Clara's footsteps climbing the wooden stairs. That specific, hesitant rhythm of someone who hasn't yet learned which floorboards creak, and then the settling silence from the second floor. Afterward, he retreated to his office, struck a match to light the kerosene lamp, opened the heavy, leather-bound ranch ledger to the page he had marked that morning, and sat staring blankly at the columns of numbers for over half an hour without actually registering a single one of them. In the 3 days that followed, the ranch slowly adjusted to Clara's presence with the natural, unhurried rhythm of things that simply need time to find their proper place. She left early, well before 6 in the morning, her leather medical kit slung over her shoulder and her coat buttoned tight, walking briskly down the red dirt road toward Elk Creek. There, she had improvised a tidy little clinic in the back room of Mr. Higgins' pharmacy. Mr. Higgins, who also ran the town's only general store, had offered up the empty storage room with a generosity born equally of civic goodness and intense professional curiosity. She would return right around dusk, sometimes much later if a complex case walked through the door, arriving back at the ranch house with her spine still perfectly straight, but her slate-green eyes slightly shadowed, carrying the specific invisible weight of someone who spends all day pouring their energy into caring for broken people. Elias watched her leave from a distance every morning, sometimes from the far pasture, sometimes from the shadows of the porch, while drinking his bitter coffee before starting his grueling day. He watched her small silhouette shrink down the dirt road until it vanished completely between the golden aspens lining the path, because it was autumn and the aspens were bursting with those bright, fiery leaves that made any dusty road look far more beautiful than it had any right to be. He didn't think much about it. Or at the very least, he fiercely told himself he wasn't thinking about it. On the 4th day, it was Silas who inadvertently orchestrated their first real moment of contact. One of the ranch hands, a burly man named Jed, had torn his hand open on a rusted barbed wire fence 2 days prior. He had slapped a dirty, improvised bandage on it, and the deep cut was now clearly, angrily infected. Silas marched up to Elias at the crack of dawn and flatly stated that the stubborn fool needed looking at, and since the city nurse was currently living under their roof, that was exactly what she was there for. Elias frowned and said that was obvious. He told Silas to go fetch her. Silas casually mentioned that the young lady was actually just walking back from the vegetable garden. She had gone out before the sun was even up to inspect the wild medicinal herbs growing fiercely along the far fence line, something Hattie had proudly bragged about the night before, and that she was crossing the front porch right at this very moment. Elias glanced out the large window of his office. Clara was indeed standing on the porch, cradling a thick bundle of freshly picked herbs in the crook of her arm, examining a single green leaf with that intense, laser-like concentration she seemed to apply to everything she looked at. There was a smudge of dark soil on the knee of her dress. Her hair was much looser than usual, and she was quietly murmuring something to herself with the satisfied expression of someone having a highly productive internal debate. Elias stood watching her through the glass for a few seconds longer than was strictly necessary to evaluate the medical situation. Then he gruffly ordered Silas to bring Jed up to the house. The medical treatment took place right on Hattie's scrubbed kitchen table, which boasted the best morning light on the ground floor. Clara examined Jed's swollen hand with the sharp, ruthless efficiency of an expert who knows exactly what she is doing. She aggressively cleaned the festering wound without Jed, a tough, seasoned cowboy in his mid-40s who was certainly not used to being coddled or needing care, doing anything more than hissing sharply through his teeth. She stitched and bandaged the hand using pristine supplies from her kit, and then instructed the massive cowboy on exactly what he could and absolutely could not do over the next 5 days. She delivered these orders with a blunt clarity that wasn't mean, but left zero room for convenient misinterpretation. Elias stood leaning heavily against the kitchen doorframe the entire time, just watching. He had absolutely no objective, practical reason to be standing there. Silas could easily have supervised, or Hattie, or honestly nobody at all, because Clara Alden clearly didn't need a damn bit of supervision from anyone. But he stood there anyway. And when she finally tied off the bandage and Jed practically bolted from the kitchen, profusely thankful but visibly intimidated by her overwhelming competence, Clara looked up at Elias with those striking slate-green eyes. She calmly stated that his ranch hand would be perfectly fine and that in a week's time the fool wouldn't even remember he'd cut himself. Elias gave a slow nod. "Good," he rumbled, and he turned back to his office. But this time he only stared blindly at his ledger numbers for about 10 minutes before finally actually managing to read them. Throughout the first full week of October, Clara slowly became a fixture that the ranch absorbed the way it absorbed the changing seasons. Slowly, without any loud announcements, in a way you only really notice once the shift has already happened. She had politely asked for permission to use Hattie's garden to identify local medicinal roots, and Hattie not only enthusiastically agreed, but began shadowing her on those crisp mornings, teaching the nurse the local pioneer names for plants, while eagerly learning the scientific ones she didn't know. Clara quietly fixed the wobbly wooden handle on the upstairs bathroom pump with a scrap of baling wire she found near the barn, never asking for permission and never boasting about it afterward. After supper, she began leaving a thick book open on the living room table, sometimes sitting by the fire to read, sometimes just sitting with the book resting in her lap, her eyes lost in the dark glass of the window. And every single night there was supper. 7 o'clock sharp, the massive 12-seater oak table, the 2 lonely chairs that Hattie had been very discreetly inching closer together. Over the course of the week, she had moved Clara's chair from 2 spots down to the seat immediately to Elias's right, acting as if she were simply correcting a previous geometrical error. The agonizing silences grew shorter, not dramatically, not all at once, but 2 stiff sentences during the first dinner grew to 5 on the second, evolved into a genuine debate about the brutal condition of the county roads on the 5th, and blossomed into a passionate, animated discussion about the medicinal properties of wild mountain yarrow on the 8th. Elias quietly learned that Clara had studied nursing in Denver, that she had spent 12 grueling years on the wards at St. Luke's Hospital, and that she had married young to a man named Thomas. Thomas had died 2 years ago from a sudden, aggressive lung infection, and she had spent the 24 months since his funeral working vastly more hours than any human being should ever work. Because drowning in labor was the only way she knew how to cope with things she couldn't fix. He discovered that she devoured books faster than anyone he had ever met, that she held fiercely unshakable opinions regarding herbal poultices and much more cautious, guarded opinions about state politics. He learned she found the mallard ducks in the willow pond absolutely fascinating from a biological standpoint and mildly hilarious from a personal one. And piece by piece, she began learning about him too. Not through direct interrogation. Elias was fundamentally not the kind of man who volunteered personal history. But truths slipped out through the cracks in his armor. In the deeply respectful way he spoke to his ranch hands, addressing every single one by their first name, armed with a quiet, encyclopedic knowledge of each man's family struggles that went far beyond what a boss needed to know to run a cattle operation. In the impossibly gentle way he handled a spooked horse, using a soothing low baritone that starkly contrasted with the sharp economy of words he used with human beings. In the devastating way he stared out at the rolling fields at dusk. That specific haunting look she had noticed on her very first night, the look of a man desperately searching the horizon for something he knows isn't coming back, but who cannot stop himself from looking anyway. On the 10th night, right in the middle of supper, Clara casually mentioned, without any specific prompt or reason, that the wraparound cedar porch on this house was easily one of the most beautiful pieces of craftsmanship she had seen in her entire life. Elias stopped eating. He looked at her. He nodded slowly and said that it was. He told her his father had built it, a man who was a master carpenter long before he ever decided to become a cattle rancher. She smiled softly and said she could clearly see that. She noted that the carved wood possessed that rare quality of something built with deep love, a quality you can always spot because the wood seems to endure time differently. Elias went completely still for a long moment, and then he spoke, using a tone of voice slightly softer, slightly different from his usual gruff rumble. He told her that his father had spent 6 back-breaking months building that porch by hand while he was courting Elias's mother, and that it was the very first place the two of them had sat together as husband and wife. He quietly added that it had always been a sacred family tradition to sit out there together at dusk. Clara softly replied that it was a profoundly beautiful tradition. Elias swallowed hard. "It was," he whispered, and immediately looked away, out the dark window. And Clara realized, in the heavy, aching silence that followed those 2 words, it was, that there was a massive, jagged, unspoken grief living inside that sentence, and she possessed the profound grace not to push him to explain it. It was on that specific night that Clara stayed awake much later than usual, lying under the patchwork quilt with her book open but unread, listening to the fierce Montana wind howling through the ponderosa pines outside, a wild, lonesome sound she had already begun to love far more than she wanted to admit. She lay there thinking that she had arrived at this remote ranch fully expecting to endure exactly 3 weeks, and that she still had 10 days left before those 3 weeks expired. And that, to her absolute shock, she was not counting down the days with anxious relief, as she had fully expected to be doing. That terrifying realization kept her awake for a very long time. On the 13th day, something incredibly small happened that wouldn't remain small in the memories of either of them. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon, and Elias had chosen to stay back at the ranch instead of riding into town for supplies, as was his usual Saturday custom. There was a structural issue with the roof of the lower barn that he wanted to personally tear into before Monday morning. Clara was also at the house. She didn't take clinic hours on Saturdays, per her contract with the town council, and she had spent the entire morning in the warm kitchen with Hattie, learning the older woman's closely guarded secret for baking perfect cast-iron skillet cornbread. Late in the afternoon, Elias was walking back up from the lower barn when he passed near the willow pond and froze in his tracks. Clara was there. She was sitting on one of the massive, gnarled willow roots that sloped down into the muddy bank. She had kicked off her sturdy leather shoes and was dangling her bare feet in the frigid October water, sitting absolutely motionless, staring mesmerized at the reflection of the towering pines on the glassy surface. For the first time since she had stepped off that wagon, her chestnut hair was completely unpinned, a thick, cascading wave that fell past her shoulders, moving gently in the autumn breeze, and she was just letting the wind take it without making any attempt to smooth it down. Elias stopped dead at the very edge of the grassy trail leading down to the water. She hadn't heard his heavy boots on the damp earth. And he just stood there for a few seconds that stretched far longer than normal time, staring at this woman sitting on a tree root with her bare feet in the freezing water and her hair wild in the wind. And his chest seized with a sudden, overwhelming feeling that he couldn't immediately identify, a feeling that took him several minutes to finally name, long after he had silently retreated and was walking back to the house. He realized with a jolt of panic that for one fleeting, devastating second, the word that had crossed his mind was beauty. Not beauty in the cheap sense that makes a young boy's heart race or his thoughts turn foolish, but beauty in the purest, most terrifying and most difficult sense of the word. The profound realization of looking at something and believing that the entire world is tangibly better simply because that specific thing exists inside it. He had backed away without snapping a single twig and taken the long way around to the front porch. But at supper that night, when Clara walked in with her hair pulled severely back into its tight bun and her sensible shoes firmly laced onto her feet, Elias caught himself involuntarily searching her face, desperately looking for some lingering trace of the wild, wind-blown hair from the pond. And the terrifying part was realizing that he was actively searching for it. That, by far, was the biggest problem of all. The initial 3 weeks officially expired on a miserable, freezing, rain-soaked Wednesday. Mayor Harrison Vance sloshed up to the porch with a dripping hat and a deeply practiced expression of agonizing embarrassment. He had come to announce that a permanent housing solution had not, regrettably, been secured yet. There were promising leads, certainly, but nothing set in stone. And he was praying to the good Lord above that Elias might find it in his famously generous heart to extend the nurse's stay for just a few more weeks. Elias simply said, "Fine." No hesitation, no drawn-out sighs, no grim expression of calculated sacrifice this time. He just said, "Fine," with such shocking, blunt naturalness that Harrison blinked twice, water dripping from his eyelashes, as if frantically checking if his ears were working. After the relieved, soaking wet Maya practically sprinted back to his buggy, Elias stood alone on the porch for a long time, listening to the heavy rain drumming against the tin roof, that specific, chaotic, comforting sound that is entirely unlike any other sound on earth. And he thought of absolutely nothing in particular, but there was a strange, buoyant lightness in that lack of thought. A lightness he hadn't even realized had been suffocated out of him until he felt his lungs fully expand with it again. Let it rain, he thought. The ranch could hold it, and in the days that followed, something began shifting at Whispering Pines Ranch with the agonizing slowness of things that refused to ask for permission but also refused to force their way in. The unstoppable slowness of the changing seasons, of crops pushing through the soil, of deep trust being built word by careful word between two bruised people who desperately need time. The suppers stretched longer. The conversations expanded far beyond the boundaries of the ranch, the town, gossip, medicine and weather, wading into deeply personal territory with a gradual, gentle tide that didn't terrify either of them because it felt entirely natural. Like a rising tide that creeps up the shore so slowly you don't even realize the sand under your feet is wet until the water is already swirling around your ankles. It was on a freezing morning in November, a full 3 weeks past the original 3-week deadline, that Clara walked back up from the pond. She had started visiting the water every single morning before breakfast. A ritual she had adopted without realizing it, and which now felt as necessary as breathing, and found Elias standing on the front porch holding 2 chipped tin mugs of steaming black coffee. 2. She stopped dead on the bottom step for a second. He was staring out at the fields, his broad back turned to her. One mug was resting precariously on the wide wooden railing, in the exact spot where she always leaned when she stood on the porch. She walked slowly up the steps. She picked up the hot tin mug, She stood right beside him, leaning her elbows on the rail, looking out at the pastures that were glowing in that intense, saturated emerald green of late autumn, when the cold rains have soaked the earth and the whole world looks overly painted. Neither of them spoke a word for a long time. Then he murmured, his eyes fixed firmly straight ahead, that the pastures were holding up well this year, that the rains had come exactly when they needed to. She took a sip and whispered that they were breathtaking, that she had never seen open land like this in her life, that the crowded streets of Denver didn't prepare a person's soul for the sheer, overwhelming scale of it all. He grunted and said there were much bigger, grander ranches further north. He called his own fields modest. She turned her head slightly and said that modest was a deeply inadequate word for what she was looking at. And he finally turned his head and looked at her. Not the fleeting fraction of a second glance that was his defensive standard, but a long, full, unflinching gaze that lasted several seconds. The kind of piercing look that truly recognizes another human being. And then he turned back to the fields. But at the very corner of his mouth there was a tiny twitch, something that if Hattie had been spying from the kitchen window, she would have confidently diagnosed as the waiting room of a smile. Hattie wasn't at the window, but her instincts were dead right. If a stranger could have observed Whispering Pines Ranch during that stretch of November, a hypothetical spy perched high up in the branches of the ponderosa pines, they would have witnessed a sequence of tiny, seemingly insignificant frames that, viewed separately, meant absolutely nothing, but stitched together, told a crystal-clear story. They would have seen a rugged man and a quiet woman drinking coffee on the cedar porch in the freezing mornings, sometimes in total silence, sometimes murmuring, always maintaining that careful, measured physical distance between them. A distance that was shrinking, millimeter by agonizing millimeter, without either of them appearing to consciously move. They would have seen the nurse treating a ranch hand's twisted ankle while the towering boss hovered nearby for absolutely no logical reason. They would have seen the two of them crossing paths in the dusty courtyard, walking in opposite directions, and stopping dead just to exchange a single pointless sentence about the wind or a newly broken colt. And the spy would have noted that these accidental crossings were happening with a frequency that mathematically defied pure chance. But above all, the spy would have seen the suppers, those two heavy oak chairs that Hattie had stealthily slid closer and closer together until they were now practically touching at the head of the table, the two plates, the two mugs, the sweating pitcher of cider between them. And they would have seen that supper now dragged on for hours, that the kerosene lamps were burning dangerously low, far past a reasonable bedtime for a rancher who woke at 4:30 in the morning. And they would have heard laughter. Not roaring, not extravagant, but present. That specific, surprised laugh that escapes your throat when you're sitting with someone and the moment creates a spark you entirely failed to anticipate. Silas was watching too, in his own distinct way, out of the absolute corner of his eye, never commenting directly, never asking a single damn question. Just quietly hoarding evidence for a verdict he had already reached, but wasn't about to announce to anyone. He kept it buried under his hat. But there was a growing, undeniable satisfaction twitching in his thick mustache on the frosty mornings when he watched his boss stride into the stables with a gait that was fundamentally different, not faster, not slower, but lighter, in a way that Silas, who had known the man for 25 years, instantly recognized even if he couldn't articulate it. It was the stride of a man whose mind was finally occupied by something other than dread, and that, in itself, was a bloody miracle. The pivotal moment where quiet observation violently transformed into something that had to be addressed out loud finally arrived on a bitter afternoon in late November, down by the Willow Pond. Clara had returned from the Elk Creek Clinic much earlier than usual. It had been a slow day, with only 2 minor ailments, and she had walked straight down to the water, honoring her daily ritual. Elias was already there when she arrived. He was sitting on a flat grey stone near the muddy bank, his back to her, staring blankly at the iron-grey clouds reflecting on the freezing water. There were two mallard ducks paddling nearby, the mated pair that had arrived in early October, the ones Clara had secretly, without telling a soul, named Aristotle and Lady Constance. She stopped walking before her leather shoes could snap a twig. She stood taking in the frozen landscape for a second, the glassy dark water, the barren weeping branches of the willows, the ducks moving with arrogant slowness. And the broad, silent figure of Elias, sitting with his heavy hands resting flat on his denim knees, his massive shoulders slightly slumped in a posture of rare, visible, breathtaking peace. She easily could have turned around and walked back to the house without him ever knowing she had been there. She didn't. She walked softly down the muddy bank until she reached the thick, gnarled willow root that had become her spot. He heard her approach. She saw the muscles in his broad back instantly tense up, the only physical sign he gave. But he didn't turn around. She sat down on the cold wood. She stayed perfectly quiet. The ducks paddled on. After a stretch of time that could have been 2 minutes or 20, Elias spoke to the water, his voice a low gravel, stating that Aristotle had shown up this morning with a bad limp in his right wing. Clara blinked, looking out at the ducks. She zeroed in on the male, noting that he was indeed holding his right wing at a slightly stiff, unnatural angle. She nodded to his back. She murmured that he probably clipped it against a branch in the wind. That he would likely heal fine, since wild ducks were vastly more resilient than people gave them credit for. Elias said he knew that, said he'd seen animals walk away from much worse. They fell back into the heavy silence. The dark water was completely dead in the center, disturbed only by the gentle, expanding ripples the birds left in their wake. And then he spoke again, still refusing to turn around, his voice dropping into that deep, chest-rumbling register he only ever used when he was being violently, terrifyingly honest about something. The specific tone Clara had learned to isolate from all his others. He said that he had spent the last 10 years coming down to this exact pond, and that in a whole damn decade he had never once given a duck a name. Clara didn't answer right away. She let the heavy sentence hang suspended in the freezing air, acknowledging its immense, terrifying weight without rushing to dismantle it. Finally, she said softly that names change things. That the second you give a name to something wild, you are forced to start paying attention to it in a completely different way. Elias slowly turned his head. Not all the way, just a quarter turn, just enough so her face entered the periphery of his vision. He stayed locked like that for several agonizing seconds. Then he turned his eyes back to the freezing water and whispered, "That's the truth." And it was a tiny, 3-word sentence that carried a devastating payload that neither of them was quite brave enough to unpack out loud yet. But they both felt the impact of it with a precision that required zero translation. That night, after supper, Elias retreated to his office as he always did. But instead of instantly cracking open the heavy ledger, he sat rigidly in his leather chair, staring through the half-open door into the dark living room, his eyes locked dead on Eleanor's acoustic guitar hanging on the wall. The instrument was caked in a decade of dust, the strings undoubtedly warped and dead. There was a vast, uncrossable ocean of time between him and that piece of wood, an ocean choked with fierce love, paralyzing agony, and a toxic, comfortable guilt he had patiently nursed for 10 years without ever stopping to ask himself if it was actually keeping him alive or slowly killing him. He stared at the guitar for a very long time. Then he stood up. He walked over to the door and pushed it firmly shut with a quiet click. He walked back to his desk. He opened the ledger to the correct page, but before his eyes dragged themselves down to the first column of numbers, he stared at the closed wooden door for a few more seconds, and there was something fundamentally different in the texture of that silence. There was a terrifying question fighting its way up his throat that he wasn't quite ready to ask, not in words, not clearly, but for the first time in 10 agonizing years, the question was forming. A tiny embryonic spark of something desperately begging to be let out. January hit the valley with a brutal, unapologetic violence. A massive winter front roared down from the mountains overnight, burying the lingering autumn under 3 feet of drifting snow. Elias woke up at 3 in the morning to the terrifying sound of the wind screaming against the wooden siding of the house, a savage, howling urgency he knew well. It was the fierce northern gale that always brought the deadly ice storms. He threw off his blankets, pulled on his heavy wool trousers, and marched downstairs to stoke the massive cast-iron stove before the house could freeze from the inside out. He had just stepped out onto the freezing porch with a steaming mug of black coffee when he saw the warm yellow glow of a kerosene lamp flare to life in Clara's upstairs window. She came downstairs 10 minutes later, wrapped tightly in her thick grey wool sweater, her chestnut hair completely undone from sleep. It tumbled wildly over her shoulders, exactly the way he had seen it down by the pond months ago, the image he had accidentally permanently burned into his brain. She stopped dead in the kitchen doorway when she saw his massive silhouette standing out on the dark porch, hesitating like a startled deer. He didn't turn around. He just rumbled into the darkness that the fire was roaring in the stove and that there was enough fresh coffee in the pot for 2. She stepped into the kitchen. She poured the scalding coffee into a tin mug. She walked out onto the freezing cedar porch, and the 2 of them stood shoulder to shoulder, staring out into the pitch-black void of the blizzard. The heavy snow was whipping horizontally across the pastures, burying the fence lines, burying the world. The freezing air made everything feel impossibly quiet and brutally honest. She whispered, her voice barely audible over the screaming wind, that it was terrifyingly beautiful, even in the bitter cold, even in the blinding dark. She said there was a strange, heavy purity to this kind of darkness that she couldn't quite find the right words to describe. Elias took a slow sip of coffee. He said his father used to call the heart of a blizzard the hour of the pines, because it was the only time the brutal land belonged entirely to the massive trees, with no sunlight to distract from their absolute dominance. She breathed out a white cloud of frost and said that was a perfect way to describe it, and they stood in silence. But it was a silence entirely divorced from any silence that had existed between them before. It wasn't the agonizing silence of 2 strangers trying to be polite. It wasn't the awkward silence of acquaintances who had run out of small talk. It was the rare, sacred silence of 2 human beings who have finally realized they can exist in the exact same space without feeling the desperate, frantic need to fill it. The kind of profound silence that only exists between 2 people who already know each other's souls, even if they are still clumsily trying to memorize the details. Right here, before we continue, let me just ask you one thing. Are you enjoying this story so far? Because it's about to get even more beautiful. So stay with me, don't go anywhere. The winter of 1935 in Elk Creek was one of the most punishing seasons the oldest ranchers in the valley could recall. The blizzards came in waves throughout January and stretched violently into February, burying the pastures under feet of snow that hardened into slick ice. The massive ponderosa pines groaned under the weight of the frozen snow, their branches encased in thick sleeves of ice that caught the blinding glare of the midday sun, turning the whole valley into a blinding, razor-sharp crystal palace that felt entirely unnatural. It was as if nature was violently showing off, proving that it could be completely, overwhelmingly excessive in its beauty when it wanted to be. Whispering Pines Ranch weathered the brutal freeze with the stubborn resilience born of decades of harsh lessons. The massive barns were packed to the rafters with hay. The cattle had been driven down into the sheltered timberlines, and the woodshed was stacked to the ceiling, a paranoid generosity Elias had learned from his father. Always chop double what you think you need, because the winter is always smarter than you are. And inside the thick wooden walls of the main house, the isolating, brutal cold was forging an intimacy that the easy heat of summer could never have achieved. Extreme cold forces spaces to shrink. It drives people to huddle around the same heat source, creates undeniable practical reasons to occupy the exact same room, to drink the same boiling pots of herbal tea Clara had started brewing in the afternoons, using the dried roots she had harvested in the fall. Hattie's kitchen officially became the beating, glowing heart of the ranch. It was where everyone instinctively gravitated when the chores were done, pulled in by the radiating heat of the iron stove, the intoxicating smell of fresh-baked bread, rich beef and barley stew, and strong, bitter coffee. And it was there, sitting at that scarred wooden table that smelled of everything warm and good in the world, that the most honest conversations finally started bleeding out. It was also the kitchen where Silas mysteriously began appearing during the most brutally cold afternoons, using the flimsy excuse of grabbing a cup of coffee he hadn't finished that morning, despite the fact that there was a perpetually boiling pot of coffee sitting right on the stove in the bunkhouse. He would stomp the snow off his boots, lean heavily against the doorframe, sip his mug, mutter 3 or 4 cryptic sentences about the frozen water troughs or the calving heifers, and then leave. But right in the gap between his arrival and his exit, there was always a fleeting moment where he would stare hard at the two of them, at Elias and Clara, with the clinical expression of a man taking silent inventory, mentally calculating the odds. Reaching conclusions he buried deep under his frozen mustache, with the iron discipline of a man who knows that speaking too soon ruins the damn work. One late afternoon, Silas lingered much longer than usual, right up to the point where Hattie aggressively slammed a bowl of stew down in front of him without anyone asking her to. He ate it with the grumpy demeanor of a man doing everyone a massive favor, and halfway through his meal, staring down into his bowl with the intense focus of an auditor reviewing a bank ledger, he flatly announced that he had caught the boss humming out in the horse stalls that morning. Elias glared at him and rumbled that it was a damn lie. Silas didn't blink. He calmly stated it was a documented fact. He noted it was a tune he didn't personally recognize, but that it hadn't sounded half bad. Hattie snatched Silas's empty bowl away and slammed down a massive slice of cornbread without saying a single word. Clara kept her eyes locked on the frosted window pane, desperately fighting a smile she was trying to bite into the inside of her cheek. She failed entirely, and a sudden bright flush of color bloomed across her cheeks that the freezing drafts of the house were completely insufficient to explain. On a terrifyingly cold afternoon in late January, when the ice storm outside was so violent that Elias had grounded every man on the ranch, forbidding any outdoor work that wasn't life or death, the three of them were trapped in the kitchen. Elias was sitting near the stove, aggressively fixing a snapped leather driving rein. Hattie was slowly stirring a massive bubbling pot of pinto beans. Clara was sitting at the table with a heavy medical journal open in front of her, though she hadn't turned a page in an hour, slowly sipping a mug of chamomile tea. The kitchen was suffocatingly hot, the steam from the beans mixing with the sharp tang of wood smoke, while outside the gale-force wind screamed against the logs with a hollow, shrieking sound that seemed to carry the ghosts of frozen pioneers. Hattie, who had observed the agonizing dance between these two stubborn fools with the monumental patience of a master gardener for months, found herself possessed by a sudden, violent urge for absolute honesty. Without taking her eyes off the bubbling beans, she loudly announced that she had a story to tell. She added that the boss was going to hate every single second of it, but that it was damn well time. Elias froze, his thick fingers stalling on the leather rein. Clara snapped her book shut with a loud crack, instantly dropping any pretense of not paying attention. Hattie talked. She talked about the cedar porch, how it had been built with sweaty, back-breaking love, meant entirely for love, and how it had sat rotting and empty for far, far too long. She talked about Eleanor, not with cheap weeping drama, but with the profound, grounded respect of a woman who truly knew someone and honored their memory with brutal precision. She stated flatly that Eleanor Drummond had been the most intensely alive, luminous woman she had ever seen draw breath. She said that Eleanor firmly believed that life was meant to be devoured whole, with both hands, with a completely open chest, and that she, Hattie, would bet her own immortal soul that if Eleanor could see that cedar porch sitting empty for 10 miserable years, she would curse Elias straight to hell and back. Elias went as rigid as a corpse. The leather strap slipped from his hands. Hattie kept aggressively stirring the beans, acting as if she were casually discussing the impending snowfall. She gruffly added that she wasn't saying all this to force anyone's hand. She stated it wasn't her damn business what the boss did with his own miserable life, but that in 67 years on this earth she had learned one inescapable truth. Too much silence, held for too long, turns into dead weight. And sometimes you have to look that weight in the eye and call it by its name before you can finally drop it in the dirt. The kitchen plunged into a silence so thick and heavy it made the howling blizzard outside sound like a whisper. It lasted longer than any silence that house had ever known. Clara stared down into her tea. Elias stared blankly at the dropped leather rain. Hattie aggressively stared at the beans. And then Elias spoke. He used that terrifyingly deep, rumbling voice of absolute truth, the voice Clara felt vibrating in her own ribs. He said he knew. He said he knew every single word of that was true. He said the problem had never, ever been not knowing. The problem was that merely knowing a thing was true was never enough to bridge the agonizing gap between knowing it and actually finding the courage to do it. Clara slowly lifted her eyes from her mug. He was still staring blindly at the leather rain on the floor, but those devastating words hadn't been meant for the leather. She didn't say a word. It wasn't the right time to speak. But the very air pressure inside that kitchen fundamentally shifted after those words left his mouth, a shift Hattie felt in her ancient bones. She stirred the pot with a tiny, triumphant smile, pointed directly at the bottom of the cast-iron kettle. That night, long after supper, was the very first time the two of them stepped out onto the freezing porch after the sun had gone completely down. It hadn't been planned or spoken of. He had simply picked up his coffee mug and walked out into the freezing dark, as had been his solitary, punishing habit. But she had picked up her teacup and silently followed him out the door. Neither of them pointed out that this broke every unspoken rule they had built, because sometimes the only way to take a terrifying new step is to just pretend you've been doing it your whole life. The January freeze on that porch was physically painful, a dense, biting cold. Clara had grabbed the heavy wool blanket off the living room sofa and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. They stood side by side, leaning against the frozen wooden railing, staring out at the pastures that were entirely swallowed by the black night, buried under a foot of snow that glowed faintly under the light of a sharp, slivered moon sitting low on the horizon. Her teeth chattered slightly as she whispered that she had never seen land frozen solid like this. She said that in the city, when the brutal cold came, there were always brick walls between you and the winter. But standing out here with no walls, staring into an endless ocean of ice, it was something completely different. It was terrifying. He gripped his mug and said that when he was a little boy, the winter terrified him. He said his father used to tell him that fearing the cold while standing inside a warm, sturdy house was a luxury, that the truly evil things the winter did were reserved entirely for the folks who had nowhere to go. Elias said it took him years to finally understand what his father meant, that the old man hadn't been talking about the temperature falling. He had been talking about the absolute life-saving necessity of having a safe place to return to. Clara fell silent, pulling the wool blanket tighter. Then she said, her voice shaking slightly, and not just from the biting wind, that she had boarded the wagon to this ranch without being entirely sure She even wanted a place to return to. She said she had fully believed this was just a job, a harsh exile, a temporary season to endure. She whispered that she had never, ever planned for this. Elias slowly turned his head to look at her, not fully, just a profile in the pitch black, illuminated only by the faint silver glow of the low moon catching the planes of his face. He asked, his voice barely a rumble in his chest, what this was. Clara took a long, shaking breath. The pause stretched out, pregnant and massive. Then she looked straight out into the dark and whispered that she was still trying to figure that out. He stared at her profile for a long time, that same intense, piercing look he had given her on the sunlit porch months ago. Then he slowly turned his eyes back to the frozen wasteland. He didn't say a single word back, but there was something deeply, profoundly different in his silence this time. It wasn't a silence that slammed a door shut. It was a silence that was pulling up a chair and waiting. The brutal month of February dragged by with that agonizing frozen sluggishness unique to deep mountain winters, where every single day feels trapped in the exact same block of ice, and the only proof that time is actually moving is realizing the sun is setting 10 minutes later than it did the week before. The ranch survived. The grueling chores that had to be done were done, fighting the ice every step of the way. Clara continued riding the wagon into Elk Creek whenever the frozen, rutted roads permitted safe passage, treating coughing children and broken bones on the days she could, and staying trapped at the ranch on the days nature aggressively refused to negotiate. And during those snowbound days at the house, fleeting moments began cementing themselves into quiet little traditions, without either of them ever daring to define them out loud. The scalding morning coffee on the freezing porch, when the world was blindingly white and the northern wind screamed through the pines. The midday dinners in Hattie's suffocatingly warm kitchen, just the three of them, unless Silas stomped in, bringing a layer of dry, sarcastic observations that made Clara throw her head back and laugh out loud, a sound that always seemed to shock her just as much as it shocked Elias. The quiet reading hours after supper, she buried in a novel, he staring blindly at the ranch ledger or a crumpled 3-day-old newspaper from Bozeman, reading with an intense focus that clearly had absolutely nothing to do with the actual news. And the stolen moments down by the willow pond, even in the dead of winter, especially in the dead of winter. The willow pond in February was a starkly different, much more hostile place than it had been in October. The water looked blacker, terrifyingly deep against the white snowbanks. The sweeping willows had lost every single leaf, their bare, twisted branches reflecting on the icy surface like violent black calligraphy scratched across a mirror. Aristotle and Lady Constance were incredibly still there, noticeably fatter than they had been in the fall. Paddling in the small circle of water they fought to keep from freezing over, moving with the obnoxious, unshakable confidence of creatures who have never had to make a complex emotional decision in their lives. And the two of them, Elias and Clara, had formed a desperate habit of walking down there at dusk when the chores allowed, not every day, not predictably, but with a burning frequency that made every encounter feel vital and every missed evening feel like a physical ache. On one of those freezing February dusks, the cold biting through their heavy coats and the sky glowing a bruised, violent purple over the snow, Clara finally took a breath and said there was something she desperately wanted to ask him, but that he was under no obligation whatsoever to answer. Elias shoved his frozen hands deep into his coat pockets and told her to ask. She kept her eyes locked on the ducks. She said she had noticed the acoustic guitar hanging on the living room wall on the very first day she arrived. She said she had noticed that not a single soul in the house ever mentioned it, and no one ever dared to touch it. She confessed she had been eaten alive by curiosity about it for months, but had violently swallowed the questions because she knew there was a haunted room inside that house she had absolutely no right to walk into. Elias went completely still. He watched the duck, the one he had secretly, without even realizing when the shift happened, started calling. The colonel, inside his own head, paddled across the dark water with ridiculous, unearned dignity. He finally spoke. He said the guitar had belonged to his wife. He said she played it beautifully, infinitely better than his clumsy fingers ever could. He said she had owned it long before he ever met her, that she had brought it with her when she moved to the ranch, and that for the 8 spectacular years they had lived together, that dark wooden house had been filled with music with such a joyful regularity that he hadn't even realized it was keeping him alive until the music abruptly stopped. He confessed, his voice breaking into a rough gravel, that after she died he didn't have the strength to pack the instrument away in a dark box, but he also couldn't stomach the agonizing pain of trying to play it himself. So it had just stayed right there, hung by the neck, trapped in the suffocating purgatory between those two impossible choices. Clara was looking at him now, giving him that total, fierce attention. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer that sickening, pitying grimace he absolutely despised when townfolks tried to bring up Eleanor's name. She just anchored him with her eyes and listened. He said her name was Eleanor. He stated she had been the most fiercely alive human being he had ever encountered. He muttered that there's an old saying that death is a tragedy entirely for the ones left behind, and in her case, it was the God's honest truth. But he confessed there was a darker, uglier truth he had spent years refusing to admit to himself. The real tragedy wasn't just her terrible absence. It was what he had deliberately done with that absence. He had taken her death, built a fortress out of it, locked himself inside, and thrown away the key. Clara didn't speak for a long time. The wind bit at their faces. Then she whispered with agonizing care that she didn't think there was a damn thing wrong with living inside your grief for a season. But the poison seeps in when the years roll by, and you start confusing the grave for your home. Elias slowly turned his head and looked at her, and there was something entirely naked in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. It wasn't the distant look of a man staring at the horizon. It wasn't the guarded, polite mask he wore for the town. It was the terrified, vibrating look of a man who realizes he is finally, truly being seen by another human being. A realization that hit him with a shock of pure wonder, mixed violently with something much older and far more terrifying. He whispered that that was a brutally accurate way to put it. She held his gaze and whispered back that she had learned the hard way, that the brutal ways to put things are usually the only true ones. The purple dusk rapidly collapsed into pitch black around them with the violent speed of winter, and they stood there until the cold became too agonizing to ignore. They walked back up the snowy trail to the house side by side. For the very first time, the careful, meticulously calculated physical distance they always kept between them was entirely gone. Their heavy coats brushed against each other in the dark, and neither of them said a damn word about it. Atty saw them walking up from the kitchen window. She closed her eyes for one long second, her face wearing that profound expression of silent, desperate gratitude that people get when something they have been praying for takes far too long to arrive, but finally shows up exactly on time. Then she turned back to her hot stove, because the braised ribs weren't going to wait for anyone, even if true love had. May arrived with a sudden, violent night that changed the trajectory of the entire world without asking a single damn person for permission. It was a Friday. The sky had been an ugly, bruised grey since noon, heavy with those violently rolling clouds that the old-timers called business clouds, the kind of storm that doesn't show up to make idle threats. It shows up to do damage. The wind had suddenly shifted direction late in the afternoon, ripping down from the northwest, which Elias instantly recognized as the most reliable, terrifying signal that the weather was about to get much, much worse before it got better. He barked orders at Silas. They drove the cattle down from the exposed ridges. They violently threw extra chains over the barn doors. Elias personally led the panicked horses into the reinforced stalls, gripping their halters, calling each one by name, speaking to them in that low, soothing rumble he always used when electricity was in the air, a language the terrified animals seemed to comprehend far better than the words themselves. Supper that night was rushed, served before 6, because Elias had warned Hattie that it was going to be a hell of a long night, and she had nodded grimly without demanding details. The cook had prepared a massive, violently thick beef and potato stew that practically burned all the way down, fighting the creeping chill in a way that felt like medicine. She pushed the heavy cast-iron pot to the back of the stove, leaving it to simmer on low heat, knowing they would need it before dawn. The spring storm finally broke at 8 o'clock, hitting the valley with a screaming violence that left zero doubts about its intentions. First came the wind, a shrieking, unnatural gale that didn't build up slowly, but slammed into the house like a runaway freight train, violently rattling the tall windows with a terrifying force that made the massive oak timbers groan. Elias knew that terrible sound from a dozen brutal springs, but it still made his jaw clench. Then came the rain. Not rain, but a solid horizontal wall of freezing water that instantly obliterated any view of the pastures, transforming the dirt road into a rushing river, turning the tin roof of the porch into a deafening, continuous explosion of noise that made speaking out loud completely impossible without screaming at the top of your lungs. The kerosene lamps were the very first casualties. A violent gust of wind found an invisible crack in the window frame and snuffed out the flames with the casual, terrifying ease the wind always uses to destroy the things men try to build. Hattie calmly fetched the thick, ugly tallow candles she hoarded specifically for emergencies and slammed them down in the center of the kitchen table, which was exactly where the three of them had instinctively huddled. Because the kitchen held the iron stove, and the stove held fire, and the fire held heat, and on a terrifying night like this, heat was the only currency that mattered. Hattie sat with them for a short while, quietly ate a bowl of scalding stew, loudly announced she was going to bed with the unshakable confidence of a woman who could sleep through the apocalypse, and marched off to her small room off the pantry. She shut the heavy door. In less than 5 minutes, the faint, steady rhythm of her snoring began vibrating through the wood. Hattie had slept like the dead for 40 years, and she was fiercely proud of it. And then, there were only 2. The kitchen instantly felt infinitely quieter than it had been, not because the howling storm outside had weakened, but because Hattie's massive presence had vacated a space that now felt electrically charged and utterly empty. The flickering tallow candles cast a dancing, violent amber light that couldn't even reach the corners of the room, trapping the 2 of them in a tiny circle of illumination, their faces leaning closely over the chipped mugs of tea Clara had frantically brewed right before Hattie abandoned them. The storm hammered the roof with a psychotic, deafening insistence, and the entire massive ranch house physically shuddered during the most violent gusts, reacting like a beautifully crafted instrument, absorbing a massive blow without shattering. Elias had both his huge, calloused hands wrapped tightly around his tiny mug, his thick elbows planted firmly on the table. A slouched, unguarded posture Clara knew he only ever assumed when he was too exhausted to remember to wear his armor. He was staring blankly into the violently flickering flame of the candle, his rugged face caught in a shadow she couldn't fully read in the dim, chaotic light. She finally raised her voice over the screaming wind, shouting that there was something brutally honest about violent storms. She said that every single polite, civilized rule you force yourself to follow gets instantly ripped away the second the wind tries to tear the roof off. She yelled that storms leave you with absolutely nothing but the bare, naked truth. Elias slowly raised his eyes. He yelled back that she was right, that storms stripped a man down to his bones. They sat in deafening silence for a long minute, while a particularly savage blast of wind physically rocked the walls of the kitchen and then shrieked away down the valley. And then Elias spoke. He didn't yell this time. He leaned heavily across the table, closing the distance between them, his voice dropping into that deep, chest-rumbling gravel that cut straight through the noise of the rain. He spoke without rehearsing, without any calculated defense, propelled entirely by the terrifying realization that his time was finally up. He said he needed to violently apologize to her. Clara's slate-green eyes snapped up to his. He stared right into them and confessed that he had been a miserable, rude bastard during her first few weeks in his house. He admitted he had treated her desperate arrival like a mild inconvenience he was being forced to tolerate. He swore to God that wasn't how he felt now, and he honestly didn't think it was how he actually felt back then. But it was exactly how he had behaved, and it made him sick to his stomach. Clara stared at him for a long, vibrating second. Then she leaned closer over the candle and whispered fiercely that he hadn't been rude at all. She said he had been terrified. She said there was a massive difference, that rudeness is born of careless cruelty, and he was the exact opposite of careless. She told him he had been so terrifyingly, obsessively careful about protecting his own broken heart that he hadn't left a single crack open for anything else to breathe. He looked at her through the amber candlelight, and burning in his dark honey eyes was a violent mixture of everything she had spent the last 8 months learning to translate. The brutal honesty of his soul, the thick iron walls he had built that were now soaking wet and tearing apart like cheap paper, and something entirely new, something that absolutely hadn't been sitting at this table during those first miserable suppers. Something that had kicked the front door down without asking for permission, the way all true things eventually do. He swallowed hard and whispered that she was being far too generous to interpret his cowardice that way. She fiercely shook her head. She whispered back that it wasn't generosity, it was clinical observation. She said 12 years in a bloody hospital ward taught a nurse how to instantly spot the difference. And right then, Elias did something she had never ever seen him do with such devastating intensity. He smiled, not a hesitant twitch, not a guarded half-smile. A full, genuine, blinding smile that completely erased 10 agonizing years of crushing grief from his face in a single second. It was a fleeting, heartbreaking glimpse of the joyful, reckless boy he had been a decade ago, a boy who was apparently still trapped down there in the dark, desperately waiting to be let out. The impact of that smile hit Clara's chest like a physical blow, like the violent shock of plunging your freezing, numb hands into scalding hot water, a sensation that violently bypasses your brain and hits your spine. The storm screamed around the house for hours, and they stayed huddled at that kitchen table, trapped in the flickering amber light of the melting tallow candles, the tin mugs refilled 2, 3, 4 times with lukewarm tea. And they talked. They talked the way two human beings only talk when they realize there is absolutely no point in hiding the bodies anymore. He talked about Eleanor. He spoke about her for real this time, not in guarded, cryptic half-sentences. He talked about the ridiculous duck she had named the Colonel. He talked about how fiercely she had loved the golden wheat fields. He talked about the dusty guitar. He talked about that suffocating Monday morning in December of 1926 and the terrible dark tomb he had built for himself out of the years that followed. He spoke with that low, terrifyingly honest rumble, and she gave him that fierce, unblinking attention that was her superpower, never interrupting, never trying to aggressively fix his grief, never diminishing a single word he bled onto the table. And then she talked. She talked about Thomas. She confessed that their marriage had been built far more on comfortable habit than burning passion, more out of a desperate fear of being alone than an active, choosing love. She admitted to the sickening, confusing guilt she carried because her heart hadn't shattered into a million pieces when he died, not the way society demanded a widow's heart should shatter. She talked about her grueling 12 years in the hospital wards, where she had learned the terrifying lesson that aggressively caring for dying strangers was vastly easier than letting a single living soul actually care for her. She confessed that she had climbed into that wagon in Denver, fully expecting to serve a miserable, lonely sentence in the middle of nowhere, only to crash headfirst into something she hadn't even realized she was starving for. Because she had forgotten what it tasted like, Elias leaned closer. He asked, his voice shaking, what that thing was. Clara went totally silent for a long, terrifying moment. Then she looked straight into his dark amber eyes and whispered that it was the shocking realization that there was actually a place on this earth where simply being herself was enough, that she didn't have to be useful or hyper-competent or desperately needed to earn her space, that she could just be Clara. With all the messy, broken, terrified pieces that name carried, pieces she was still desperately trying to figure out how to put back together. The violent storm finally broke its fever somewhere between midnight and 1 in the morning. The shrieking gusts of wind lost their psychotic edge. The horizontal wall of water softened into a heavy curtain, then a steady drizzle. And finally, a sudden, shocking silence crashed down on the house. A silence that felt infinitely louder and more profound than any quiet that had existed before the storm, because the sheer contrast made everything in the room feel terrifyingly sharp. They were still sitting at the table. The mugs had been empty for an hour. The very last tallow candle had melted down to a nub, throwing a frantic, dying light that felt aggressively intimate. And the air trapped between their faces possessed that terrifying electric density that only exists between two people who have just spent 4 hours peeling off their own skin and showing the other person exactly what they look like underneath. Elias slowly leaned back. He whispered, his voice incredibly rough, that he had realized something terrifying over the last 8 months, and that he had been hoarding it in his chest because he was too damn much of a coward to know what to do with it. Clara didn't blink. She whispered, "Tell me." Elias took a ragged breath. He said he had spent 10 agonizing years convinced that absolute loyalty to Eleanor meant he was never allowed to want anything ever again, that he had to violently murder his own ability to feel. That freezing his life into a miserable, unchanging block of ice was the only honorable way to respect what they had shared. He said it had taken him a decade for someone to finally smash him over the head and make him realize that wasn't loyalty at all. It was just paralyzing fear wearing a noble mask, and that Eleanor, the most aggressively alive human being he had ever known, would have been violently disgusted that he dared to confuse the two. Clara didn't move a muscle. Elias stared at the dying candle. He whispered that he didn't know how to do this anymore. He said he had completely forgotten how the machinery of the heart worked. He confessed he was terrified that he was too late, not because his hair was graying, but because the hinges on the door inside his chest had rusted shut from 10 years of disuse, and he didn't know if he was strong enough to rip it open again. Clara leaned forward. Her voice was lower than a whisper, vibrating right through the wood of the table. She said that rust eventually gives way if you have enough patience. She said it might take a terrifying amount of time, but it eventually breaks. He snapped his eyes up to hers, and then, with the terrifying, reckless precision of a man who has made a choice and refuses to back down, he said he had learned to instantly recognize the specific creak of her footsteps on the floorboards above his head. He said he knew the exact second she walked into a room because the scent of her chamomile tea hit him before he even turned around. He said he had named a damn duck for the first time in 10 years, and the name he had chosen without even realizing he was doing it was the Colonel, the exact same name Eleanor had given her favorite bird a decade ago. He said a piece of his soul had realized, long before his stubborn brain tried to fight it, exactly what that meant. He swallowed hard. He whispered that he had absolutely no right to know if she felt anything even remotely similar. He said he would completely understand if she thought he was a broken, foolish old man. But he said the crushing weight of keeping it locked in his chest had finally become more agonizing than the terror of dragging it out into the light. The tallow candle flared wildly in its pool of wax, the flame dancing frantically despite the dead air in the room, driven entirely by its own dying energy. Clara stared right into his eyes, and she said that she felt it too, just like that, brutally simple. No evasive speeches, no dramatic hesitation. She said yes. She confessed she had felt it for months, and that she had forced herself to stay agonizingly silent because 12 years of dealing with broken people had violently drilled one lesson into her skull. You cannot drag a person out of the dark. You have to sit there and wait for them to find the flashlight themselves. She whispered that if you try to kick open a rusted door, you only shatter the frame. It was vastly better to sit in the dark and wait for the rust to finally surrender. Elias sat completely paralyzed by her words. Then he let out a shuddering breath and whispered that she possessed far more patience than he could ever deserve in 10 lifetimes. Clara fiercely shook her head. She whispered that patience had absolutely nothing to do with it. She said the only thing that actually mattered was the only thing that had ever mattered. That truly great, terrifying stories demand to be told on their own agonizing schedule. And the right time is never when it's safe or convenient. The right time is the exact second it finally becomes true. The candle violently sputtered and died, plunging the kitchen into absolute suffocating darkness, leaving behind a thin trail of acrid smoke that vanished into the black air. And right there, in the pitch black of the kitchen, in the deafening, exhausted silence that follows a violent storm, surrounded by the smell of melted wax and the cold wind finally returning to the pines outside, Elias Drummond blindly reached his massive, shaking hand across the wooden table and covered Clara Alden's hand with his own. She didn't flinch. She immediately turned her hand over and fiercely locked her fingers through his. And they stayed exactly like that, trapped in the pitch black, surrounded by the dripping windows and the howling spring wind for a stretch of time that absolutely defied measurement. Right here, just a moment. Let me ask you, if you've made it this far in the story and it's touching your heart, share it with someone you love, because stories like this are meant to be felt together. What followed that terrifying, beautiful night was a profound transformation that Whispering Pines Ranch absorbed exactly the way it absorbed the changing of the seasons, with agonizing slowness, with quiet dignity, and with absolutely zero fanfare. Elias didn't miraculously wake up a completely different man the next morning, loudly declaring his joy to the heavens. The shifts were vastly more subtle than that. They were the kind of microscopic changes you only recognize when you turn around and look back from a mile down the road. The steaming coffee on the freezing porch was now explicitly, undeniably poured for two. The suppers stretched into a territory of astonishing, unforced lightness that the dark dining room hadn't witnessed in a decade. Not a cheap, empty lightness, but a hard-fought, bloody lightness that only exists after the darkest truths have been dragged out and survived. And Eleanor's acoustic guitar, which had hung dead and gathering dust on the living room wall for 10 agonizing years, was finally taken down on a sweltering afternoon in August. Elias sat alone in the empty living room for an hour, just holding the heavy wood in his lap, staring at it before his trembling fingers finally reached up to touch the tuning pegs. Clara had walked into the living room completely unaware of what he was doing. She stopped dead in the doorway when she saw him. And she didn't make a single sound. He kept his eyes glued to the instrument and muttered that the strings were completely dead. He said it was going to take a long damn time to coax them back into tune. She leaned against the doorframe and whispered that they had all the time in the world, and he painstakingly tuned one dead string at a time, moving with the agonizing, reverent patience of a man who understands that resurrecting something beautiful cannot be rushed, until the tension was finally right, and then he plucked a single chord, just one for today. And the sound it made in that silent room was infinitely more beautiful than he had ever dared to hope. Hattie, who was aggressively scrubbing a pot in the kitchen, stopped dead the second she heard that single chord ring out from the front of the house. She squeezed her eyes shut for a long, shuddering second, and then she went right back to furiously scrubbing the pot, because the supper chores weren't going to do themselves, and because she knew in her bones that the most sacred miracles are best honored by keeping your mouth entirely shut. May brought the full explosion of spring to the Elk Creek Valley, and the Montana spring was a violent, chaotic miracle that had to be witnessed to be believed. It was as if the brutal, punishing winter had spent 6 months hoarding all of the Earth's energy just to detonate it all at once. The massive pastures that had been buried under 3 feet of dead ice in January were now screaming with a vibrant, aggressive green that looked freshly invented. The wild balsam root and golden aspens lining the dirt road were erupting into blinding yellow life, and the visual shock of that hyper-saturated yellow against the wet red earth was one of those breathtaking chromatic accidents that nature effortlessly throws together, completely indifferent to its own terrifying beauty. The side garden, Eleanor's yellow roses, the sprawling lavender bush, the wild marigolds, was exploding into a riot of color that made the imposing wooden facade of the ranch look like a painting by a madman who had lost his mind and used far too much paint, but accidentally created a masterpiece. Clara had started kneeling in the dirt alongside Hattie back in the fall, not trying to take over, but adding her own quiet touch. She had carved out a small patch next to the lavender, strictly for her medicinal roots and herbs. Hattie had eyed the encroaching weeds with extreme suspicion for a week, and then seamlessly began aggressively incorporating them into her massive stews, accepting the intrusion with the blunt pragmatism of a pioneer woman who recognizes a good thing when she tastes it. On a brilliantly clear afternoon in May, Elias rode out to pick Clara up from the Elk Creek Clinic for the very first time. He hadn't taken the wagon. He had saddled his massive buckskin, and he was leading a gentle, steady bay mare by a rope, a horse specifically chosen for someone who hadn't spent their entire life in a saddle. Halfway down the dirt road heading into town, right where the path hooked sharply to the east, there was a specific, elevated ridge that offered a sweeping, God's-eye view of the entire ranch. The dark pines guarding the horizon, the tin roof of the massive house catching the late afternoon sun like a blinding silver mirror. Elias stopped both horses dead on that ridge, just as he had done 1,000 times before in his life, pausing with the unconscious instinct of a man checking his own heartbeat. He sat in his creaking saddle and stared down at the sprawling property, but there was something fundamentally different in the way he looked at it this time. For 48 years, it had always been the heavy, calculating stare of a man evaluating his empire, filled with fierce pride, crushing responsibility, and the bone-deep exhaustion of a man chained to his land. But today, the math was different. Today, he saw the phantom image of Clara standing on the cedar porch holding a tin mug. He smelled the ghost of chamomile tea wafting from the kitchen. He heard the phantom echo of her footsteps moving across the ceiling above his office. And the staggering realization hit him, hitting so hard he actually gripped the saddle horn, that there was vastly more life vibrating inside that wooden house right now than there had been in a decade. Not more work, more life. The distinction was subtle, but it was everything. He rode into the dusty main street of Elk Creek with that terrifying realization burning a hole in his chest. He tied the horses to the hitching post outside Mr. Higgins's pharmacy, pulled his hat down low over his eyes, crossed his massive arms over his chest, and leaned against the wooden post in a posture the entire town instantly recognized from 50 yards away. And he waited. He waited with his usual stoic silence, but the chemical makeup of that wait was entirely different, because waiting for something is a completely different animal when you actually believe it's going to show up. Clara walked out the pharmacy door. She froze when she saw the 2 horses. She looked slowly up at him. He tipped his hat and rumbled that he happened to be passing through town, and figured the ride back to the ranch was a hell of a lot more pleasant in a saddle than walking in the dirt, provided she wasn't opposed. She looked warily at the massive bay mare, then back at him, a slow, brilliant smile breaking across her face that took a full second to arrive, but hit with the force of the sun when it did. She confessed she had never actually ridden a horse in her entire life. He muttered that it was just physics. He promised the bay was practically asleep, and swore he wouldn't leave her side for a single second. And he didn't. They rode the entire 5 miles back down the dusty road, surrounded by the screaming yellow of the blooming aspens, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and wild sage. It was the exact same brutal, exhausting trek Clara had walked 100 times before, but sitting in that saddle, with Elias Drummond's massive buckskin matching her horse step for step, it was a completely different universe. Mr. Higgins had watched them ride out of town through the dusty front window of his pharmacy. He stared until they completely vanished around the bend. Then he slowly turned back to his counter, looked at his wife, and flatly stated that he had a strong, sneaking suspicion the new nurse was going to be staying in Elk Creek a hell of a lot longer than her contract required. His wife aggressively rolled her eyes and snapped that it had been glaringly obvious since October. Mr. Higgins slowly nodded, conceding that perhaps she was right, and that sometimes the folks standing on the outside of a burning building are the first ones to realize it's actually on fire. The autumn of 1935 hit the valley with that breathtaking golden violence specific to the mountains, not the terrifying white death that winter would bring, but a slow, burning transformation that turned every single pasture into an oil painting. The massive ponderosa pines remained violently green and unbothered, but the cottonwoods and aspens along the river ignited into blinding shades of yellow, burnt orange, and blood red, until Whispering Pines Ranch looked like it was surrounded by a raging forest fire that didn't consume a single leaf. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon in October of 1935, 1 full year and a month since the golden afternoon Clara had stepped off the wagon with her leather suitcase, that Elias finally dragged the truth out into the light, using the most brutally simple words his brain could find. They were standing down by the willow pond. It was the golden hour, the sun bleeding orange across the water. Aristotle, because Clara had finally confessed the ridiculous name out loud, and Elias had immediately decided it was perfect, and Lady Constance were executing their usual arrogant patrol across the glassy surface. There was a third, scrawny duck that had mysteriously shown up during the brutal freeze of February, and neither of them had dared to name it yet, operating under a terrifying, unspoken agreement that they would name it together when the time was finally right. Elias stared hard at the ducks and rumbled that he had held a meeting with the town council. He stated there was a sturdy little house right on the edge of Elk Creek that had just gone up for sale. He said it was small, but it would make a damn fine permanent clinic. He strictly maintained his gaze on the water as he aggressively offered to personally finance the purchase if she wanted to stay. He threw out that it could be a formal bank loan or any kind of legal arrangement that didn't make her feel trapped. Clara turned her head and stared at his rigid jaw. He swallowed hard and muttered that he was clumsily attempting to ask, in the most cowardly, indirect way possible, if she actually had any intention of staying in this valley. She went totally still for a terrifyingly long moment. Then she whispered that it depended. His jaw clenched tighter. He asked what the hell it depended on. She didn't blink. She said that if her decision depended solely on a brick house and a permanent clinic, the answer had been a screaming yes since February, but she whispered that there was one massive, terrifying variable left in the equation, and she desperately needed to know if she was calculating the math correctly, or if she was just a foolish woman inventing numbers that didn't actually exist. He closed his eyes. He rasped, "Name the variable," and she looked out at the dark pond for one single second, at Aristotle and Lady Constance gliding through the water, at the violent reflection of the autumn pines, and then she turned her slate-green eyes directly onto his face. She whispered that the variable was him. Elias stopped breathing for a stretch of time that felt like the most critical, agonizing minute of that entire autumn. He opened his eyes, locked onto hers, and rumbled, "The variable is a yes," just like that, with the brutal, naked simplicity that is the absolute most terrifying, courageous way a human being can ever speak. Clara smiled. That agonizingly slow, brilliant smile that seemed to literally change the air pressure in the room. A smile that didn't possess a clinical name, but that everyone who truly knew her recognized instantly as her entire soul bleeding through her face. And the third, scrawny duck, who was frantically paddling in circles on the far side of the pond, finally received its name that golden afternoon. She confidently announced that the duck's name was obviously Hope. Elias let out a rough laugh and muttered that it was a mighty damn grand name to hang around the neck of a bird. Clara shot back that the grandest, heaviest names are specifically reserved for the broken things that desperately need them to survive. Elias didn't say another word, but in that ringing silence, a sensation washed over his entire body, something astonishingly light and terrifyingly warm, something he hadn't felt in over 10 years. A sensation he recognized as it slowly settled into his bones to stay permanently as the profound, shocking realization that he was standing exactly where he was supposed to be. What violent fate had kicked into motion on a golden September afternoon in 1934, time slowly and meticulously built into a fortress in the months that followed. Elias and Clara didn't rush a single damn thing, because there was absolutely no reason to panic. The miracle had arrived on its own agonizing schedule, exactly when they were both finally ready to survive it, and it continued at that pace. The brick house in town was bought in cash and transformed into the desperately needed permanent clinic for Elk Creek. Clara Alden sank her roots into the rocky Montana soil with the violent depth of a woman who hasn't just found a grueling job, but a divine purpose. The battered families of the valley began calling her Miss Clara with that fierce, protective mixture of terror and awe, reserved strictly for people who actually hold the power of life and death in their hands. Eleanor's acoustic guitar began echoing through the dark halls of Whispering Pines Ranch again, not every night, not in wild, roaring parties, but on quiet Sunday evenings after supper, while the lamps burned low and Hattie sat in her wooden chair in the kitchen, aggressively pretending she couldn't hear a damn thing, while eagerly absorbing every single note. And the wraparound cedar porch, which had sat rotting and empty for exactly as many years as Elias's shattered chest, finally had people sitting on it again. Imagine this place right now, years down the road. The afternoon is bathed in that blinding, generous May light that the spring uses to violently announce it has finally conquered the winter. A light that lacks the oppressive heat of summer or the decaying melancholy of fall. It is simply pure, resurrected light in the most literal sense of the word. The massive pastures rolling away from the porch are screaming with a vibrant, violent green, and the ponderosa pines guarding the horizon are wearing their eternal, stoic color, that dark, unshakable green that refuses to bow to the changing seasons because there are a few rare, stubborn things in this world that simply choose to stay. On that cedar porch, which smells of ancient wood, And the scalding black coffee Hattie is still aggressively brewing, using the exact same recipe she's used for 40 years, sit two heavy oak rocking chairs. And sitting in those chairs are two human beings who spent far, far too much of their lives utterly convinced that the most honorable tribute they could pay to the people they had buried was to violently murder their own desire to live. Two people who slowly, painstakingly taught each other, without either of them even realizing a lesson was taking place, that the most profoundly beautiful, terrifying act of loyalty you can ever offer the dead is to prove that your heart is still capable of love. Elias's massive, scarred hand is resting heavily over Clara's on the wide wooden armrest. She has a thick book open in her lap, but her eyes aren't on the pages. She is staring out at the rolling fields with the terrifyingly calm expression of a woman who knows down to her marrow that she is home. Drifting up from the willow pond at the bottom of the hill is the faint, ridiculous sound of ducks fighting over the water. Aristotle, Lady Constance, and Hope are executing their daily, pointless patrols, completely and utterly ignoring the monumental, agonizing drama of human existence with the arrogant, unbothered dignity that is the exclusive privilege of ducks. The red dirt road is totally empty at this hour. The golden aspens haven't turned yet, but the frantic, screaming green of the spring leaves is exploding on the branches, carrying that ancient, violent promise that the spring never, ever fails to keep. Silas comes stomping across the dusty courtyard below with his rolling, wide-legged stride, his thumbs hooked aggressively into his belt. He tilts his worn hat up toward the porch for one single second, and his thick mustache twitches in that specific microscopic way that is his version of a joyful smile. Then he snaps his head back down and keeps marching toward the barn. Hattie is in the kitchen. She is always in the kitchen. And the heavy, intoxicating smell of fresh-baked cornbread drifting through the open window to the porch is the exact same smell it has always been. The smell that refuses to change. The smell that aggressively proves that a safe place exists, that the fire is burning hot, and that the people who would die for you are sitting right beside you. Elias gently squeezes Clara's hand. She slowly pulls her eyes away from the green fields and looks at his rugged face. And he is staring out at the horizon, wearing that exact same expression Hattie had once described decades ago. The terrifying, breathless look of a man who genuinely believes the world is an extraordinary place. A look that had been violently buried for 10 years. A look that had fought its way out of the dark. Clara smiles, that slow, devastating smile that alters the gravity of the room. And the two of them just sit there on the cedar porch while the afternoon slowly bleeds away behind the hills, basking in the profound generosity of the spring sun, which has absolutely no rush to leave, lingering until the very last possible second, like a guest who knows that certain afternoons deserve to be witnessed until the bitter end. This is the terrifying, beautiful story of a man who learned the hard way that honoring the dead does not require you to stop breathing. That the human heart is not a tiny, sealed wooden box with limited seating. It is a violently expanding universe that grows precisely to accommodate whatever you are brave enough to shove inside it. That sometimes salvation doesn't arrive with a screaming trumpet and a flash of lightning. Sometimes it rolls up on a golden September afternoon, straight down a dusty dirt road, carrying a battered leather suitcase and looking at the broken world with a pair of eyes you've never seen before. And if you are still here, having walked this entire agonizing, beautiful road to the very end of the story, it's because you secretly believe it too, that love doesn't carry an expiration date, that life aggressively hoards its most staggering, beautiful miracles for the exact second you have completely given up hope. That the wooden porch can always have people sitting on it again, no matter how many terrifying years it sat empty in the dark. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. This story was told with all my heart, just for you.